This is a homily for the 12th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 20, verses 10 to 13. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 10, verses 26 to 33. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. In his book Sources of the Self, The Making of the Modern Identity, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor argues that one of the defining features of the modern Western world is the way people have come to understand the self. In the ancient and medieval world, people generally believed that they fitted into a larger cosmic order, held together by God or some kind of universal moral law. A person's place in the world was shaped by family, community, tradition, moral obligation, and above all, by relation to God. Individuals understood themselves within that given framework of meaning. Identity was largely received rather than invented. By contrast, modern Western culture increasingly understands the self as autonomous and self-defining. Identity is no longer primarily received, but constructed. People are encouraged to look inward, to discover who they really are by attending to their private feelings, desires, and sense of authenticity. The highest good is no longer conformity to truth or obedience to God, but being true to oneself. The modern self is therefore profoundly inward-looking. One's identity is something to be shaped according to personal choice. The older sense of a sacred order that gives objective structure and meaning to human life no longer commands universal assent. What Charles Taylor helps us to see is that in modern Western culture, the inward turn of the self has become one of the organizing assumptions of social life. People are encouraged to look within for identity, to treat inward feelings as the primary guide to who they are, and to regard self-definition as a fundamental right. The self becomes both the center of concern and the measure of truth. And it is precisely that condition which Jesus confronts in today's Gospel as he sends out the disciples. The first thing Jesus addresses is fear, because fear is one of the principal forces that drives the human person inward. Fear makes people preoccupied with self-preservation, anxious about reputation, and reluctant to risk comfort, security, or social acceptance. If the disciple is to be sent outward in mission, then fear must first be confronted. It is therefore no accident that the dominant command in this section of the Gospel is repeated 3 times. Do not be afraid. In the Greek text of the New Testament, the most common verb behind the command, do not be afraid, is phobomai, from which we derive the English word phobia. In its basic sense, it means to fear, to be afraid, or to be terrified, though in some contexts it can also carry the sense of reverence or awe. Here in Matthew chapter 10, the meaning is plainly fear in the ordinary sense, anxiety, dread, fear of harm, fear of opposition. The command Jesus uses is me phobiste, do not be afraid, or more literally, stop fearing. The form is a present imperative with the negative particle may, which often carries the force not merely of prohibiting a future action, but of commanding someone to cease an attitude or behaviour already taking hold. The sense is not simply never become afraid, but rather do not continue in fear. Do not let fear govern you. That same verb is used repeatedly throughout the New Testament whenever God or Christ addresses those who are afraid in the face of divine revelation or mission. The angel says to Zechariah, "Me phobu," the singular imperative, do not be afraid. The same is said to Mary. Jesus says it to the disciples in the storm. The risen Christ says it to the women at the tomb. Again and again, when human beings are overwhelmed, whether by danger, by divine presence, or by the demands of discipleship, the answer is the same. Me phobu, the singular imperative, or me phobise, the plural imperative. The reason this matters is that fear is not treated in Scripture merely as an emotion. It is treated as a spiritual obstacle. Fear is one of the principal forces that inhibits faith, paralyzes obedience, and silences witness. That is why, as Jesus sends the disciples out, he addresses fear before anything else. If fear governs them, the mission will fail before it begins. Jesus offers the 12 two powerful reasons why the disciples should not be afraid. Firstly, he tells them that everything that is now covered will be uncovered, and everything now hidden will be made clear. The participle Matthew uses here is kekulomenon, which comes from the verb kalupto, meaning to cover or to veil. Our English word apocalypse derives from this same verb, but with the prefix apo, which means away from or off. So kalupto means to cover or to veil, while apocalypto means to unveil or to reveal. At this point in the Gospel of Matthew, the identity of Jesus and the message of the kingdom are only partially understood. They remain veiled. Jesus is telling them that this will not remain so. What is now spoken quietly, or literally in the ear, as the next verse says, will one day be proclaimed openly from the housetops. In other words, the message they carry may still be veiled and therefore be misunderstood or even rejected for a time, but it will come into the open. As New Testament scholar Tom Wright explains, their resolute determination to follow the Lord of life wherever he leads will be vindicated. Truth will out. Justice will prevail. Those who have lived with integrity and innocence, despite what the world says about them, will be vindicated. Secondly, Jesus tells the disciples, "Can you not buy 2 sparrows for a penny, and yet not one falls to the ground without your Father knowing?" This second reason that Jesus gives rests on a very different kind of argument. The first looks to the future unveiling of truth. This second reason looks to the present knowledge and care of God. Jesus points to something utterly ordinary, sparrows. He says the 2 sparrows are sold for a penny, of almost no value in the marketplace, and yet not one of them falls to the ground without the Father knowing. The point is not that sparrows are important in themselves, but precisely the opposite. They are of negligible value, and yet even at that level, nothing escapes God's knowing. Their falling is not outside his awareness. It is not beneath his concern. From there, Jesus moves to the more striking image. Even the hairs of your head are all numbered. This is not about arithmetic. It is a way of speaking about complete and intimate knowledge. The number of hairs on a person's head is both constantly changing and utterly beyond our own awareness. Yet Jesus says that God's knowledge extends even there. So the force of the argument is clear. If God's care extends to what is of little value, sparrows, and if God's knowledge extends to what goes virtually unnoticed, the hairs of your head, then how much more does it extend to the disciples themselves? And that is exactly the conclusion Jesus draws. So do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Notice what kind of reassurance this is, and what it is not. It is not a promise that nothing bad will happen. In fact, the whole discourse assumes opposition, rejection, and even death. Sparrows do fall to the ground. Rather, it is a claim about God's knowledge and care in the midst of opposition and persecution. Nothing that befalls the disciple lies outside the Father's knowing. Nothing is beneath his concern. So the reason not to fear is this: you are not alone, not overlooked, and not at the mercy of chance. Nothing about your life escapes God's knowing. The one whom you serve is stronger than anything set against you. This is not just a theoretical assurance. It is the lived experience of the prophet Jeremiah. In today's first reading, we hear Jeremiah at a very precise moment in his ministry. The prophet has been sent to Jerusalem in the final years of the kingdom of Judah, as the Babylonian Empire is rising in the east. His message is stark. The nation's political alliances, its religious complacency, and its confidence that the temple will guarantee its safety are all misplaced. Judgment is coming, and unless there is genuine repentance, Jerusalem will fall. That message brings him into direct conflict with the religious leadership. He stands in the temple and warns that it could suffer the same fate as Shiloh. Shiloh had once been the central sanctuary of Israel, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept and where the people gathered to worship. But after Israel's defeat by the Philistines, it was destroyed and abandoned. By invoking Shiloh, Jeremiah is saying something shocking. The temple in Jerusalem is not untouchable. It too can be judged. For saying this, Jeremiah is seized by Pashhur, a senior temple official. He is beaten and placed in the stocks at one of the city gates, publicly exposed and humiliated before the people. He is not simply ignored, his punishment is meant to warn others. So when Jeremiah says, "I hear many whispering, terror on every side, denounce him, let us denounce him," he is describing the hostile atmosphere that now surrounds him. The words terror on every side, his own warning to the people, are now thrown back at him as a term of ridicule. Those around him, even former friends, are watching for him to slip, hoping to trap him or discredit him. He is isolated, under pressure, and in real danger. And yet, in the midst of that, Jeremiah makes a striking confession. "But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior. Therefore my persecutors will stumble. He does not deny the fear or the hostility. He speaks of them plainly, but he refuses to let them have the final word. He entrusts himself to the Lord, who sees, who knows, and who will ultimately vindicate him. This is precisely what Jesus prepares his disciples for in today's gospel. What Jeremiah experiences, the disciples will also face: opposition, rejection, and the pressure to remain silent. And the assurance is the same. Nothing is hidden that will not be revealed, and nothing in their lives lies outside the Father's knowing. Now the theme of fear takes an unexpected turn. Up to this point, Jesus has been telling the disciples not to be afraid. But then he adds something striking. There is, in fact, someone they must fear. Jesus says, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear the one who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." To understand this, it helps to recognize that there are two sides to the human emotion of fear. On the one hand, fear alerts us to danger. In Moby Dick, Herman Melville's great novel about whaling, the first mate, Starbuck, says that the only men he wants in his boat are men who are afraid of whales. Those who are afraid truly know the power and awesome strength of their adversary and are not likely to be foolhardy. But fear can also be debilitating. We hear of people being paralyzed with fear. That is the kind of fear that Jesus has in mind when he tells the 12 not to be afraid. There will be those who can harm them, even take their lives, but their power is limited. They can touch the body, but no more. Their authority does not extend to the whole of a person's life before God. So, the disciples are not called to be without fear. They are called to be free from the kind of fear that paralyzes, and to live with a right fear of God, not terror, but a reverent awareness of who God is and of the fact that their lives are in his hands. The final section of today's Gospel brings the teaching to a decisive point. Jesus now speaks about what it means to stand with him openly. "Everyone who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven." Up to this point, the focus has been on fear, what the disciples are not to fear and what they are to fear. Now the question becomes, what will they do when they are put to the test? That is the situation Jesus is preparing them for. They will find themselves in circumstances where they must either speak or remain silent, either stand with him or distance themselves from him. And this is not only about the 12. When Matthew writes his Gospel, some 50 or 60 years later, he is addressing a community that is already experiencing opposition and, in some cases, persecution. For them, these words are not theoretical. The question of acknowledging or denying Christ is a lived reality. So the issue is not simply belief, but confession, where the one is prepared to be identified with Christ before others. And that is where the earlier teaching on fear comes to its point. The disciples are not to be paralyzed by fear of opposition. They are to take God seriously, trust in his knowing and care, and have the courage to acknowledge Christ openly. But in the end, the decisive question is this: not simply whether we know him, but whether we are prepared to be known as his. New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne offers this reflection on these words of Jesus. If we never experience discomfort and embarrassment in professing and living the faith, if we never have to confess Jesus in a way that means standing apart from the crowd, have we truly heard the good news for which at our baptism we were claimed? We do not have to look far to see what that looks like in practice. In A Man for All Seasons, Robert Bolt captures the moment when Thomas More is placed under exactly the kind of pressure Jesus speaks about in today's Gospel. More had been appointed Lord Chancellor of England in 1529, the highest office in the realm under the king. Henry VIII wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. He sought More's support. After careful study, More told the king that he could not agree. But many influential and powerful people did support the king. You can see here a photo of a letter sent to Pope Clement VII pleading for the annulment of the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The letter includes the wax seals of the members of the English House of Lords, clergy, and other nobility who wrote and signed the letter. There is a scene in Bolt's play where Henry visits More at his home in Chelsea. The king tells More, "I have no son. It is my bounden duty to put away the queen, and all the popes back to St. Peter shall not come between me and my duty. How is it that you cannot see? Everyone else does." "Then why does your grace need my poor support?" "Because you are honest. What's more to the purpose, you're known to be honest. There are those like Norfolk who follow me because I wear the crown. And there are those like Master Cromwell who follow me because they are jackals with sharp teeth, and I am their lion. And there is a mass that follows me because it follows anything that moves. And there is you." However, it soon became obvious to the king that the Pope was not going to accede to his request, and that he must break with Rome if he was to marry Anne Boleyn. On the 15th of May, 1532, the clergy made their formal submission to the king. More could have remained silent. He could have conformed outwardly and justified it to himself. But he understood that in that moment silence would not be neutral. It would amount to a denial of the Church's teaching and the authority of the Pope. The following day, Thomas More resigned as Lord Chancellor. He was later charged with treason and, on the 6th of July, 1535, executed on Tower Hill, remaining, as he himself said, the king's good servant, but God's first. You can still visit the site of his execution. A plaque at the site names him as one who was executed there. You'll notice also the name of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, who was also executed because he would not support the king in the matter of his annulment. More was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1935. Consider this more recent example of the cost of discipleship. In February 1945, the chief rabbi of Rome, Israel Zolli, was received into the Catholic Church along with his wife Emma. This was a public and momentous decision. He was the chief religious authority of the Jewish community in Rome and a distinguished scholar of the Scriptures and the Talmud, He was a renowned authority on the history and linguistic structure of Semitic languages. For a man in that position, such a step could not have been sudden or superficial. It would have involved a long and searching engagement with the scriptures he knew so well, and finding in them something that led him step by step to Jesus. Significantly, Zolli did not understand this as a rejection of his Judaism, but as its fulfillment. He came to recognize in Jesus the Messiah promised in the scriptures he had studied all his life, Rabbi Yeshua. In his own account, Before the Dawn, he expresses that discovery with striking simplicity. Jesus is the Messiah. His conversion to Christianity came at a profound personal cost. It was not merely a shift from one religious community to another, but a complete upheaval of his life. By relinquishing his office as chief rabbi, Zolli did more than surrender a position. He surrendered his identity. He walked away from the pulpit of the great synagogue into a social and professional vacuum. His world collapsed almost overnight. He stepped into a future marked by isolation and financial hardship. He would later say that on entering the church, he and his wife had lost everything we had in the world. The loss was mutual and absolute. The great synagogue of Rome proclaimed a fast of atonement and mourned him as though he were dead. At his baptism, he took the name Eugenio, the name of Pope Pius XII, in gratitude for the Pope's efforts to save Jews during the war. Zolli had publicly acknowledged Christ. That could neither be hidden nor undone. And that is the point. The gospel does not ask for a private conviction that remains concealed. It speaks of a moment when a person must stand and be counted, when silence becomes a form of denial, and when acknowledging Christ carries a cost. And that brings us back to where we began, with Charles Taylor and his account of the modern self. We live in a culture that prizes control, autonomy, and self-protection, a way of living that seeks to keep life manageable, contained, and, as far as possible, secure. But the gospel moves in a very different direction. It does not promise a life that is controlled or insulated from risk. It calls the disciple to step beyond that instinct for self-protection and to live in trust before God. Jeremiah lived that trust under pressure. The disciples were sent out to live it in the face of opposition. Thomas More lived it before a king. Israel Zolli lived it at the cost of his position and his place within his community. And the question now turns to us, because there comes a moment, sometimes quietly, sometimes with real consequence, when silence becomes a form of denial, and in that moment the choice is laid bare. So the gospel leaves us with a simple but demanding truth, not simply whether we believe, but whether we are prepared to acknowledge Christ and to be known as his.